So imagine a factory, just, a massive, sprawling industrial complex.
Right, like a huge manufacturing plant.
Exactly. And it has the exact same hundreds of workers walking through the turnstiles this morning as it did yesterday. It has the same heavy machinery humming on the floor, the exact same raw materials sitting in the loading bay.
It's pumping out the exact same number of physical products, basically.
Yeah, the atomic structure of this business hasn't changed one single bit. So let me ask you, why would that company suddenly be worth half as much money overnight?
I mean, it sounds like a riddle, right? But it's actually the fundamental paradox of our modern financial system. Because if you look at it strictly through the lens of physics or engineering, it makes absolutely zero sense.
None at all.
The output is identical, the capability is identical, but the value just, it drops.
Right. And usually when we evaluate a business, or the broader economy for that matter, we expect this level of physical precision. You just count the assets.
Yeah, the accountant points at a ledger, points at the trucks, points at the concrete, and says, there it is. That is what it's worth.
But today, we are hunting down the invisible ghosts that actually run our economy. Welcome to the Deep Dive. And if you are joining us today, our mission is to sort of pull back the curtain on the unseen forces that govern our money, our global markets,
And even our most intimate daily decisions, really.
Totally. We are diving into some incredible research today, specifically centering around an excerpt titled When You'll Believe Anything: Appealing Fictions and Why Stories Are More Powerful Than Statistics.
It's such a vital discussion because it kind of forces us to dismantle our default worldview.
Yeah, it really does.
The baseline premise we have to establish right now is that when humans think about the economy, we are incredibly biased toward the tangible. We think about resources we can pull out of the ground, cargo ships crossing the ocean, the physical labor force.
The stuff we can touch.
Exactly. But the reality is that stories are the most powerful force in the economy. They aren't just the background noise of the market. They are the literal fuel that makes the tangible parts of the economy function.
Or, I guess, they are the brake pedal that brings all of our physical capabilities to a screeching halt.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp how an invisible story can hold a physical, multi-million-dollar factory hostage, we need to look at this brilliantly illuminating thought experiment from the source.
Oh, the alien auditor. I love this one.
It's so good. So I want you to picture this scenario. Imagine an alien is dispatched to Earth, like an interstellar auditor. And his sole directive from his homeworld is to keep tabs on the human economy.
Right. He is supposed to measure our output and our wealth.
And he's going to do this by observing us at two very specific, very critical points in recent history.
He wants to track how things changed between the absolute peak of the market in 2007 and the absolute trough of the Great Recession in 2009.
Exactly. Yeah. So on New Year's Eve 2007, our alien auditor hovers his ship right over Times Square in New York City. And he looks down.
Taking notes on his little alien clipboard.
Right. And I really want to paint the picture of what he sees, because the sensory details matter here. He sees tens of thousands of happy, screaming partygoers packed shoulder to shoulder.
Blindingly bright lights, massive digital billboards pulling just a ridiculous amount of electricity.
Yeah, fireworks are exploding overhead. There are dozens of high-definition TV cameras broadcasting this exuberance to the entire globe.
He is basically witnessing the physical manifestation of a booming, confident civilization. People spending money, infrastructure operating at peak capacity, telecommunications just humming along.
So he takes his notes, zips away, and then he comes back to that exact same spot 2 years later. New Year's Eve, 2009, the absolute depth of the financial crisis.
A bottom of the barrel.
He looks down again. What does he see? Tens of thousands of happy partygoers, surrounded by the exact same bright lights, the same monstrous billboards, fireworks, TV cameras.
Visually, from his vantage point, the physical reality of Times Square looks completely identical.
He cannot see a single missing pixel on those billboards.
And if he expands his audit beyond Times Square, the confusion only deepens. He scans the rest of Manhattan and sees roughly the same number of New Yorkers hustling down the avenues the next morning.
Going to work.
Right. Those people are walking into the exact same number of steel and glass office buildings. Inside those buildings, he counts the exact same number of desks, holding the same number of computers, all hooked up to the same broadband internet infrastructure.
And let's say he flies outside the city, out into the American heartland. He sees the same number of massive manufacturing plants.
The same sprawling Amazon warehouses.
Yeah, and they are all still connected by the exact same web of interstate highways. And those highways are carrying the exact same number of 18-wheeler trucks moving goods from point A to point B.
Everything physical is entirely intact.
He flies over MIT and Stanford, and the buildings are still standing, the professors are still teaching the same advanced mathematics, handing out the same degrees to the same number of highly capable, intelligent human beings.
The patent offices are still protecting the exact same groundbreaking engineering ideas.
The physical, intellectual, and infrastructural capacity of humanity hasn't gone anywhere.
But what's genuinely fascinating here is that if the alien looks really closely at the technology, he doesn't just see a stagnant physical world, he actually sees things getting markedly better.
Oh, wait, you mean because of the leap in tech between '07 and '09?
Exactly. Think about the technological leap there. In 2007, a few people had early smartphones, but mostly people were on flip phones or Blackberries.
Right, I had a Motorola Razr in 2007.
See? And by 2009, millions of people are suddenly carrying these supercomputers in their pockets with glass touchscreens. The processors in those office computers he saw, they are significantly faster.
Medical treatments have advanced. We have better solar technology coming online, massive leaps in fracking technology, unlocking new energy reserves.
The hardware of society has actually been upgraded.
So the alien finishes this incredibly thorough physical audit flying around the globe, and he writes his final report for the homeworld. He basically says, the human economy is in exactly the same shape and arguably, objectively better and more advanced in 2009 as it was in 2007.
He's ready to turn in the assignment.
Yep. But then he logs into a terminal and looks at the actual financial data.
And he completely loses his mind.
Because the data makes absolutely no sense based on the physical reality he just observed.
The numbers are devastating. Despite identical or actively improved physical conditions across the board, U.S. households were $16 trillion poorer in 2009 than they were in 2007.
Let me just repeat that number for you.
Okay.
$16 trillion evaporated.
10 million more Americans are suddenly unemployed. The stock market, which is supposedly the mechanism we use to determine the value of all those companies with the same factories and the same workers, is worth exactly half of what it was just 24 months prior.
It's just gutted.
Yeah, and beyond the hard numbers, the general forecast, the optimism people had about their own potential, has completely collapsed.
You can just imagine this alien screaming at us like, I don't get it. I've seen the cities. I've counted the trucks. You guys have the exact same knowledge, the exact same tools, the exact same raw materials. Not a single physical asset has disappeared. Why are you suddenly acting like you were plunged into poverty?
Which brings us to a really profound realization. There was one massive change the alien couldn't see, precisely because he was only looking at tangible metrics. He was counting atoms.
But he couldn't see the narratives.
Right, he couldn't see the stories we were telling ourselves about the economy.
Narrative damage. That's the phrase from the source that really stuck with me.
Right. Yes, narrative damage. In 2007, the collective story that hundreds of millions of people all agreed upon was a story of absolute, unshakable stability. We believed that housing prices simply could not go down on a national level.
We believed in the prudence and the mathematical genius of investment bankers.
We believed that the financial markets had perfectly quantified and priced risk. That shared belief was the lubricant that allowed all those physical assets to move and trade.
But wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the actual mechanics of this. I understand the psychology. We stopped believing the story in 2009. But functionally, how does a loss of belief actually cause a massive wave of layoffs? Walk me through the mechanics of how a thought in a Wall Street banker's head literally stomps a factory line in Ohio.
It's a vicious, self-fulfilling domino effect. Let's trace it. It starts simply. The narrative that home prices will keep rising forever breaks.
People realize it's a fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the belief breaks, a certain percentage of people suddenly owe more on their house than it's worth, and they default on their mortgages.
Okay, physical action number one, stopping the mortgage payment.
Exactly. Now, because those defaults rise unexpectedly, the massive banks holding those mortgages suddenly realize their balance sheets are bleeding billions of dollars. They panic.
And what does a panicked bank do?
It stops lending money, not just to home buyers, but to everyone. The credit markets freeze.
Ah, okay. So now we move from the housing market to the broader economy.
Right. So now, think about a completely unrelated business. Let's say a mid-sized paper supplier in Ohio. They have absolutely nothing to do with subprime mortgages, but they rely on a standard, boring line of credit from their bank just to make payroll every 2 weeks while they wait for their clients to pay their invoices.
Which is super common for businesses.
Very common. But suddenly the bank calls and says, We are terrified of the market. We are revoking your line of credit.
Wow. So the paper company still has the same customers, the same physical paper, the same demand, but their financial oxygen is cut off.
Precisely. So the paper company, just to avoid going bankrupt, immediately lays off 20% of its workforce.
And those laid-off workers in Ohio suddenly have zero income. So they stop going to the local restaurants, they cancel their gym memberships, they stop buying new clothes.
And because consumer spending drops, the local restaurants and retail stores lose revenue. They then have to lay off their own workers, which reduces spending even further. It is a catastrophic spiral born entirely from a shift in a collective thought.
I look at it like a massive computer system.
All right.
The hardware of the economy, the factories, the human bodies, the trucks, the highways was perfectly fine. The alien verified the hardware was pristine.
We had even upgraded the RAM and put in faster processors with the new smartphones, to use your analogy.
Exactly. But the software, the trust, the shared narrative, the lines of code that tell the hardware what to do, that software contracted a virus and it crashed the entire operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
But it really forces me to push back a bit. Is narrative damage genuinely as destructive as physical damage? It feels like, since it's just in our heads, we should be able to just hit a reset button, like a psychological reboot.
It's tempting to think that, yeah, but history proves how lethal this software virus actually is. Think about Germany in 1945. Their manufacturing base, their railways, their cities, literally, physically obliterated by thousands of tons of explosives.
Complete devastation.
Or look at Japan in the 1990s and 2000s, where their working-age population was physically, demographically shrinking. That is tangible, undeniable economic damage. You literally do not have the buildings or the human bodies to produce wealth.
The hardware is actually broken in those scenarios.
But in 2009, America inflicted pure narrative damage upon itself, and the economic contraction was just as vicious and in some ways more contagious than a physical catastrophe.
It wiped out $16 trillion of wealth without a single bomb dropping or a single factory burning down.
It proves that the collective story isn't just a byproduct of the economy. It is arguably the single most potent economic force that exists.
Okay, so we've established that the collective story can crash a global economy. The sheer scale of that is terrifying. But it naturally leads to the next question.
Which is,
if these narratives are so fragile and so potentially destructive, why are individual humans, why are we so incredibly susceptible to buying into faulty stories in the first place?
that's the million-dollar question.
Right. I mean, if the math was always bad on subprime mortgages, why did so many brilliant people believe this story? How do we get infected by the virus?
Well, to understand that, we have to explore the psychology of what the source calls appealing fictions.
Appealing fictions.
Yeah. There is a very clear rule about human nature at play here. The more you want something to be true, the more likely you are to believe a story that wildly overestimates the odds of it being true.
So our own desire literally blinds us to probability.
It alters our cognitive processing completely. An appealing fiction is a specific psychological trap. It generally happens in situations where a person is highly intelligent and they genuinely want to find a rational solution to a problem, but they are facing a toxic, volatile combination of two things:
And what are those?
limited control and exceedingly high stakes.
Limited control and high stakes. You know, when you put those two together, you get desperation.
You do.
And when I look at the historical case studies of this in the text, it's actually deeply heartbreaking just how far desperation will push a smart person into believing in absolute verifiable fiction. Take the anecdote about Armistice Day.
Oh, from that documentary.
Yeah, a documentary filmmaker was interviewing a centenarian, a woman over 100 years old, and he asked her a very simple, innocent question. He said, "What was the happiest day of your entire life?"
And her answer is incredibly revealing about human psychology, because she doesn't say her wedding day. She doesn't say the birth of her children.
She says, "Armistice Day, November 1918, the day the treaties were signed to end World War I."
And when the filmmaker asks her why that specific day was the happiest, she replies, "Because we knew there would be no more wars ever again." If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profound, tragic example of an appealing fiction. Think about the trauma of World War I. The introduction of mechanized slaughter, chemical weapons, millions of young men dying in muddy trenches for yards of dirt.
The psychological toll on the global populace was just unprecedented.
Absolutely. The stakes, the literal survival of their sons and brothers, were incomprehensibly high. And the average citizen's control over the geopolitical forces driving the war was absolute zero.
High stakes,
Or
zero control.
So when the war ended, they universally bought into the narrative that this was the war to end all wars. The human brain could not process the idea that such horrific suffering might ever happen again.
They desperately needed the story of everlasting peace to be true, so they believed it as an absolute fact.
But the dark objective reality is that World War II began just 21 years later, bringing even more destruction and killing 75 million people.
The story of everlasting peace was an appealing fiction born of desperate trauma. It was a psychological shield.
It was. And we see this move from the geopolitical scale to the deeply, intimately personal scale in the story of Ali Hajaji.
Yeah, this one is really tough to process, but it highlights the mechanism perfectly. Ali Hajaji lived in a rural Yemeni village, and his young son was desperately sick.
And he had no options.
None. Hajaji had no money. He had no access to modern hospitals or antibiotics. He had extremely limited control over his environment, and he was facing the highest stakes imaginable to a human being, the impending death of his own child.
So the elders in his village came to him and proposed a traditional folk remedy. They told him to take a burning stick, a literal glowing ember, and shove the tip of it through his son's chest to drain the sickness from his body.
To our modern sensibilities, that is horrific. It sounds like literal torture.
It does, but you have to look at the quote Hajaji gave to a reporter afterward. It is the crux of this entire psychological principle. He said, when you have no money and your son is sick, you'll believe anything.
You'll believe anything. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, why does the brain do this? Why doesn't the brain just say, I have no valid options, I must accept defeat?
Because inaction in the face of the death of your offspring is biologically, evolutionarily unendurable. The human brain is wired to seek agency.
It has to do something.
Right. If a scientifically valid solution isn't available, the brain will not simply shut down and watch the tragedy unfold. The path of least psychological resistance is to latch on to any narrative that offers a sliver of hope, no matter how absurd.
You become willing to believe anything, because the alternative, admitting you are totally helpless, causes too much cognitive dissonance.
And it's crucial to point out that you don't just try the burning stick cynically. You don't say, well, this is stupid, but I'll give it a shot. You actually believe it will work. Your brain rewires itself to perceive the quackery as legitimate medicine.
We saw this play out on a mass societal scale during the Great Plague of London, too. Let's look at Daniel Defoe's accounts from 1722.
Defoe was chronicling a horrific 18-month period where the bubonic plague swept through London. Again, look at the variables. The stakes. Death. 25% of the entire population of the city died.
And the control, 0. Nobody in the 17th century understood germ theory, fleas, or bacteria. It was an invisible, unstoppable killer.
So what happens to the collective psychology? Defoe writes that the people of London became more addicted to prophecies, astrological conjurations, dreams, and old wives' tales than at any other time in history.
He describes walking the streets and seeing the posts of houses plastered over with advertisements from what he called ignorant fellows and quack doctors.
And these ads didn't offer subtle help. They had these incredibly confident, flourishing promises. They were selling infallible preventative pills against the plague or never-failing preservatives against the infection.
Sovereign cordials against the corruption of the air.
Exactly. When the stakes are literal life and death and you have zero control, you will absolutely hand your life savings over for an infallible preventive pill. You aren't buying medicine, you are buying the illusion of control.
Now, if you're listening to this, you might be wondering, okay, this is fascinating, morbid history. But what does a 17th century plague doctor selling fake pills or tragic folk remedy in a Yemeni village have to do with my retirement account? What does this have to do with the modern financial economy?
It has everything to do with it because the psychological mechanism running in the background is completely identical. In modern finance, the stakes are incredibly high for the average person.
We're talking about the ability to retire securely, send your kids to college, or, conversely, face financial ruin and poverty in your old age.
Yet, the level of control the average worker has over the macroeconomic environment, inflation rates, global supply chains, Federal Reserve policy is virtually zero.
High stakes, limited control. It is the exact recipe for an appealing fiction.
It really is.
So how does this manifest in our daily financial lives?
It manifests in our desperate need for gurus and financial profits. Think about why millions of people tune into cable television investment shows. You have pundits aggressively shouting market predictions, confidently telling you exactly which stocks will double next month.
Now, objectively, most of these pundits have very little track record of verifiable long-term success. But why is the audience so massive?
Because if you get just a few stock picks right, you can become independently wealthy without doing any actual labor. If there is even a 1% chance that a guy shouting on a financial network has the secret, and that secret will fundamentally change your family's socioeconomic status, your brain says it's not crazy to pay attention just in case I want it to be true.
We default to believing what we want to be true because the reward is so intoxicating. Let's look at the data on active mutual funds because this completely blew my mind.
Oh, this is the perfect example.
For those who might not know, an active mutual fund is a pool of money managed by highly paid Wall Street professionals. Their entire job, the reason you pay them hefty fees, is to actively buy and sell stocks to beat the market, to perform better than a standard passive index fund, which we call the benchmark.
Right. You are paying a premium for their supposed genius.
But the data from the source shows that 85% of active mutual funds underperformed their benchmark over the 10 years ending in 2018.
Let that sink in.
85% failed to do the very thing they charge fees to do. You would have been better off just buying a dumb automated index fund and going to sleep for a decade.
And that 85% failure rate isn't a fluke of that specific decade. That figure has been remarkably stable for generations. Think about that rationally. In literally any other industry on Earth, if a premium service failed to deliver on its core promise 85% of the time, it would go out of business immediately.
If 85% of mechanics ruined your car, or 85% of dentists pulled the wrong tooth, that industry would cease to exist.
Absolutely.
But the active mutual fund industry hasn't ceased to exist. In fact, there is currently almost $5 trillion invested in these actively managed funds. $5 trillion. I have to ask you, how is that mathematically possible? Why does $5 trillion stay in a system that fails 85% of the time?
Because they aren't selling math. They're selling an appealing fiction. When you invest in an active fund, you get glossy brochures. You get quarterly letters written by guys in custom suits talking about macroeconomic trends. You feel like you are part of an exclusive club of smart money.
They offer the chance, however statistically improbable, that you are investing alongside the next Warren Buffett.
People want to believe that there is a genius out there who can protect them from the chaos of the market, and they will believe it with such blind faith that they will endure years of underperformance, constantly convincing themselves that next year, their manager will finally get it right.
That's a profound point. Investing is totally unique in this regard. It is one of the only fields that offers daily opportunities for extreme, life-altering rewards.
Okay.
Think about a TV meteorologist. If a weatherman went on TV and claimed he had a proprietary, secret algorithmic system for predicting rain with 100% accuracy a year in advance, we'd laugh at him.
We call it weather quackery.
Exactly. Why? Because the extreme reward isn't there. The reward for predicting the weather correctly is just knowing whether to wear a jacket. It doesn't change your life. But the reward for predicting the stock market correctly is millions of dollars. The extremity of the reward literally breaks our brain's ability to calibrate probability.
This vulnerability to extreme rewards raises an important question about how fraud operates at the highest levels, too, and the ultimate example of this is Bernie Madoff.
The largest Ponzi scheme in human history. Tens of billions of dollars evaporated. Now, looking at how Madoff operated, it seems like in hindsight, his scheme should have been glaringly obvious to anyone with a calculator.
It absolutely should have been. The red flags were everywhere. Madoff reported returns that basically never varied. Whether the broader stock market was up 20% or down 20%, Madoff's fund just steadily churned out 1% a month, which is mathematically absurd. Markets are volatile by nature.
Furthermore, his multi-billion-dollar, globally renowned operation was audited by a completely unknown three-person accounting firm in a strip mall.
And whenever major banks asked him to explain his options trading strategy so they could verify his returns, he outright refused, claiming it was a proprietary secret.
Red flags on fire. But here is the crazy part. He didn't just scam naive, amateur retail investors. He wasn't preying on grandmothers in Florida. He raised billions of dollars from some of the most sophisticated, highly educated institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and royal families in the world, people whose literal job was to analyze risk.
The brightest minds in finance.
How did he bypass their intellect?
He bypassed their intellect by offering them the ultimate appealing fiction. In a chaotic, stressful, wildly unpredictable financial world, Madoff offered an oasis of perfect stability. He told a story of steady, stress-free, elite returns.
He also utilized the psychology of exclusivity, right?
Yeah.
He would often turn investors away at first, making them beg to give him their money.
Oh, absolutely. These sophisticated investors wanted the stress-free returns so badly. They wanted the prestige of being in his exclusive club so badly that their desire for the outcome completely overrode their analytical rigor.
Hmm.
They looked at the red flags and chose to look the other way because the fiction was too comfortable to abandon.
Okay, let's pause and synthesize this. If our own desperation, our desire for extreme rewards, and our fear of high stakes make us susceptible to financial quackery, whether it's a TV pundit, an overpriced mutual fund, or a literal criminal like Madoff, how do we protect ourselves?
That is the big question.
If our brains are biologically hardwired to fall for this because of evolutionary mechanics, what is the psychological buffer? Is there an antidote?
The antidote is a concept called room for error, or building a massive margin of safety into every forecast you make.
Right, because if we are constantly relying on forecasts to navigate the future, we have to deeply understand the danger of how our own desires corrupt those forecasts.
Exactly. The biggest risk in your financial life isn't that your forecast is slightly off. It's not that you predict your portfolio will grow by 8% and it only grows by 7%. You can survive that.
Sure.
The catastrophic risk, the risk that ruins lives, is that you want a certain outcome so badly that your forecast isn't even in the same universe as reality. The dangerous gap is the space between what you want to be true and what you need to be true in order to simply survive an acceptable outcome.
And to illustrate just how remarkably bad we are at forecasting when our desires and incentives are involved, let's look at the ultimate financial authority, the United States Federal Reserve.
Oh, the 2007 meeting.
Yes. We are talking about an institution with thousands of PhD economists on staff, access to unlimited, real-time global data, and immense analytical power. Let's look at their late 2007 policy meeting. They are sitting around the big mahogany table trying to predict economic growth for 2008 and 2009.
And remember the context. It's late 2007. The housing market is already showing severe cracks. Bear Stearns is wobbling. They know the economy is weakening, so they aren't being blindly, wildly optimistic.
They sit down to calculate what they believe is a highly conservative margin of error. They predict a range of potential GDP growth. On the high end, they predict 2.8% growth. On the absolute low end, their worst-case nightmare scenario, they predict 1.6% growth.
So their worst-case absolute rock-bottom prediction is still positive growth of 1.6%.
And what was the actual reality?
The reality was that the economy didn't grow at all. It contracted by more than 2%.
The smartest economists on the planet with the best data were off by almost threefold on their absolute worst-case scenario.
What's fascinating here is the why. Why did they miss it by an order of magnitude? It comes down to human incentives. It is incredibly hard, psychologically and professionally, for a policymaker to predict an outright devastating recession.
Why is that? Is it the fear that if the Fed chairman goes on TV and predicts a crash, the panic alone will actually cause the crash?
That is a massive part of it, yes, the observer effect. But it's also deeply personal. A severe recession makes their own careers deeply complicated. It means they failed at their mandate of maintaining economic stability.
It means congressional hearings, public outrage, and historical infamy.
So they are heavily incentivized to believe in a narrative of resilience. Even their worst-case projections rarely expect anything worse than just slowish growth. Believing in a minor slowdown is an appealing fiction for a central banker. It's easy for them to believe because expecting anything worse, expecting the total collapse of the global banking system, is simply too painful to consider. It threatens their professional identity.
It's tribal. It reminds me of being a die-hard sports fan. Imagine you just spent $5,000 buying season tickets for a team that has been historically, agonizingly terrible. Once you make that financial investment, once you buy those tickets and put on the jersey, your brain flips a switch.
You have to believe.
You genuinely start to believe they're going to win the championship this year. You look at a mediocre, unproven rookie and convince yourself he's the next Michael Jordan. You completely lose the ability to objectively evaluate the team's talent because you are financially and mentally invested in that tribe. You picked a strategy, and now you psychologically need it to work.
That is a perfect analogy because while it's easy to mock the Federal Reserve, we all do this exact same thing to ourselves with our own money. If you decide that a recession is coming and you take dramatic action, say you cash out your entire 401k and put it all in gold or cash under the mattress, you've now picked a side. You have bought the season tickets for Team Recession.
You are deeply invested in that narrative.
And what happens next is wild. Suddenly, your view of the global economy gets totally warped by what you want to happen. You start scanning the news every morning, and every minor, insignificant blip, a tech company missing its quarterly earnings by a penny, a slight dip in consumer confidence, a weird fluctuation in the price of lumber, looks like a definitive sign that the apocalyptic crash has arrived.
Not because it actually has, but because you need it to arrive to validate your decision to sell all your stocks.
You become entirely incapable of calibrating low odds. You see confirmation everywhere. This is why we must always audit our own incentives. The higher the personal stakes of a decision, the wider your room for error must be, because your own brain is actively trying to trick you into believing appealing fictions that validate your past choices.
Okay, so our desires and our incentives warp our forecasts. Our need for a specific outcome actively blinds us to mathematical reality. That covers the things we want. But what about the things we simply don't know, the massive, gaping blank spaces in our knowledge? How does the brain handle the void?
That leads us to the second major psychological principle we need to unpack. Principle 2 states that everyone has an incomplete view of the world, but we form a complete narrative to fill in the gaps. We cannot handle the void.
To explain this, there is this incredibly endearing but profoundly illustrative example from the source text. Think about a 1-year-old toddler. Let's look at the epistemology of a child. I want you to picture a toddler sitting in a living room playing with blocks. Think about all the concepts that child cannot possibly comprehend.
She has no idea why her dad puts on a suit and leaves the house every morning.
The concept of a mortgage, paying for the roof over her head, household budgets, career ladders, saving for college. These are completely alien concepts. Try explaining the intricacies of international supply chains or Federal Reserve interest rate hikes to a 1-year-old. It's impossible.
Her internal database of the world is basically empty. She operates with an incredibly limited set of mental models.
Right. But here's the critical insight. Her world is not a terrifying, dark abyss of confusion. She doesn't crawl around the living room in a state of paralyzing existential dread, wondering how the electricity stays on. She has managed to construct a few dozen basic, reliable mental models.
She knows that fuzzy blankets keep you warm. She knows that snugbles with mom means she's safe. She knows that when a certain cabinet opens, she gets crackers.
And how does she process the vast unknown? When her dad leaves for work and she is suddenly deprived of his attention, she doesn't freeze up wondering if he was laid off due to macroeconomic headwinds. She forms a perfectly coherent, complete, closed-loop story based only on the variables she currently understands.
Exactly. Her internal narrative is crystal clear. Dad isn't playing with me. I wanted him to play with me. Therefore, Dad is bad and I am sad. Boom. The narrative loop is closed.
She knows absolutely nothing about the reality of his commute or his job, but she doesn't realize she knows nothing because she tells herself a complete story that makes perfect sense within her limited mental models.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sobering, humbling reality is that full-grown adults do the exact same thing. Every single one of us. We do not know what we do not know.
The global economy has trillions of moving parts, driven by the irrational emotions of 8 billion people. It is impossible to comprehend.
So we are just as susceptible as the toddler. We try to explain incredibly complex geopolitical events, inflation spikes, wars, market crashes, through whatever limited set of 3 or 4 mental models we happen to have at our disposal. We look for the most easily understandable causes, and we are almost always wrong because we know far less about the world than we think we do.
And what's wild is that this isn't just a flaw of the uneducated or the uninformed. This illusion of a complete narrative plagues even the most rigorous academic subjects. Take history, for example. You would think history is immune to this. History is just the objective recounting of stuff that already happened, a sterile timeline of facts. But there is a brilliant insight from military historian B.H. Liddell Hart.
Yes. Hart points out that history cannot actually be interpreted without the aid of imagination and intuition. The sheer quantity of historical evidence, every letter written, every troop movement, every weather pattern, is so overwhelmingly massive that selection is inevitable. The historian cannot include everything, and where there is selection, there is art.
Where there is selection, there is art. I love that framing. The act of choosing which facts to put in the textbook is an act of storytelling.
It means the historian is always crafting a narrative. Hart goes on to say that people who read history tend to look only for what proves them right. They read to confirm their personal opinions. They read with a purpose to affirm their own tribal loyalties or to attack their political enemies. They actively resist inconvenient historical truths because everyone wants to believe they are on the side of the angels.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we can bring in Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who pioneered behavioral economics.
Hmm.
Kahneman talks specifically about how we use stories to make sense of the past. He says that hindsight, our ability to look backward and explain what happened, gives us the illusion that the world is understandable.
It gives us the illusion that the world makes sense even when it fundamentally is driven by chaos and randomness.
We simply cannot tolerate a chaotic, senseless world. It causes too much biological distress. So when confronted with a complex, random event we don't understand, we don't say, wow, the universe is random and I have no idea why that happened. We stitch together a story. We use our own unique, limited perspective, and we fill in our massive blind spots with fiction.
We seal the cracks in our understanding with narrative spackle.
And Kahneman applies this psychological quirk directly to the business world, specifically looking at entrepreneurs. He observed something fascinating about startup founders. When you ask a founder, to what extent will the ultimate outcome of your startup depend entirely on what you do in your firm? Meaning, how much of your success is based purely on your own hard work, your own late nights, and your own decisions? They almost never say less than 80%.
They believe their fate is almost entirely in their own hands. They are the masters of their universe.
Right. But Kahneman points out they're mathematically, objectively delusional. The outcome of a startup depends just as much, if not more, on the achievements of unseen competitors, massive macroeconomic changes in consumer behavior, and sheer dumb luck.
But founders naturally focus only on what they know best. Their own business plans, their own actions, their own venture capital funding. They know very little about the thousands of competitors working in stealth mode across the globe, so they naturally imagine a future where the competition plays little to no part.
They fill the blank spaces of the competitive landscape with a story of their own inevitable triumph. But let me push back on this for a second, because I feel like we are painting this delusion as a purely negative thing. Is this delusion actually necessary? Think about the startup grind. Sleeping under your desk, risking your life savings, facing a 90% failure rate.
It's brutal.
If an entrepreneur genuinely accepted the statistical reality, if they fully internalized how much of their success was totally out of their control, dependent on luck and invisible market forces, would they ever even get out of bed to start a company?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the sheer weight of that uncertainty paralyze them?
You've hit on the profound evolutionary tension here. The delusion is a survival mechanism. It is the psychological armor required to take massive, terrifying risks. If the human brain tried to process the sheer volume of unknown variables in the market, it would cause paralyzing cognitive dissonance. We create fictions literally to allow ourselves to function.
So it's not all bad.
No, if entrepreneurs didn't have that appealing fiction of control, human innovation might grind to a total halt. However, while that delusion might be biologically necessary for the entrepreneur to invent a new product, it is an incredibly dangerous, toxic mindset when applied to investing and managing a retirement portfolio.
Because it leads to mass dilution. It leads to bubbles.
Exactly. This explains why forecasting the stock market is impossibly difficult. It's because you are the only person who thinks the world operates the way you do. You have your unique, coddler-like mental models. The millions of other investors trading on the market today have theirs.
So if I blindly follow you into a trade,
You might be following me for reasons you don't comprehend, based on a deeply limited narrative I've told myself to fill in my own blind spots. When thousands of people blindly follow each other based on incomplete, comforting narratives, asset prices completely detach from underlying reality. That is the anatomy of every financial bubble in history.
so we crave these complete narratives. We physically need them to avoid feeling paralyzed by the chaotic void of life. But it brings us to a really fascinating paradox, which we have to explore. Because if we know deep down that the human economy is a messy, chaotic web driven by emotional primates, why do we constantly expect it to behave like a clean, predictable math equation?
It is the ultimate paradox of finance. If you ask most seasoned investors in private, off the record, no one genuinely thinks market forecasts as a whole are highly accurate. We all know the TV pundits are basically guessing. We know the 85% failure rate of active managers.
And yet there is a tremendous, insatiable demand for these forecasts in the media, from financial advisors and in boardrooms. If we know they are mostly wrong, why do we pay billions of dollars for them?
There is a psychologist named Philip Tetlock who perfectly diagnoses this. Tetlock says, we need to believe we live in a predictable, controllable world, so we turn to authoritative-sounding people who promise to satisfy that need.
I love that phrasing, authoritative sounding, not necessarily accurate, just confident. A guy in a nice suit with a good chart.
Right. Satisfying that need is an emotional itch that desperately needs to be scratched. When a CEO hires a high-priced consulting firm to forecast the next 5 years, it is not an analytical problem being solved. It is a psychological therapy session for the board of directors. The illusion of control is far more persuasive and far more comforting than the cold, shivering reality of uncertainty.
And to really drive this point home, to show the difference between real precision and the illusion of control, let's contrast the field of economics with the field of astrophysics. Let's look at the NASA New Horizons spacecraft.
Oh, this is a great comparison.
This is one of the most mind-blowing feats of human engineering. NASA launched this probe in January 2006. Its mission was to fly to Pluto. It took a 9.5-year journey across 3 billion miles of empty freezing space. And when it finally arrived at Pluto a decade later, it arrived within 1 minute of the time NASA predicted at launch.
The accuracy is staggering. It's 99.99998% accurate over a decade. To put that into perspective, that is the equivalent of forecasting a trip from New York to Boston and predicting your arrival time to within 4 millionths of a second.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, why can NASA scientists do that? But the chairman of the Federal Reserve can't predict a massive recession 6 months out.
Because NASA operates in a vacuum, literally and figuratively. Astrophysics is a field of pure precision. It is governed by the iron laws of physics, gravity, and mathematics. It is completely, entirely unaffected by the vagaries of human emotion.
Pluto doesn't get greedy. A comet doesn't panic and sell its shares because it read a bad headline.
Exactly. The trajectory of a planet is not dependent on an appealing fiction.
Right. But finance, business, and economics are entirely fields of uncertainty. They are overwhelmingly driven by the messy, unpredictable, biologically driven decisions of millions of irrational humans. You cannot put human fear into a clean mathematical formula. You cannot calculate the exact trajectory of panic.
But we desperately want to. We desperately want our money, our life savings, to act like the trip to Pluto, because the idea of a NASA engineer being in 99.99998% control of an outcome is beautiful. It is so comforting that we are constantly tempted to tell ourselves stories about how we have that same level of control over our financial lives if we just find the right algorithm or the right mutual fund manager.
But we don't. The math will always be corrupted by the emotion. And that's why there's this fantastic quote from financial planner Carl Richards. He says, "Risk is what's left over when you think you've thought of everything. You can build the most complex, beautiful Excel spreadsheet in the world. You can read every historical chart dating back to the Roman Empire. But the real risk is the invisible narrative you couldn't see coming, the story that changes overnight."
Which brings us completely full circle, because if we can't be NASA engineers with our money, who are we?
We are the alien. We've spent this entire deep dive unpacking why a shift in a collective story can wipe out $16 trillion of tangible wealth without breaking a single window. We've looked at how our own high stakes and desperation make us believe in magic plague pills and expensive financial gurus.
We've explored how our brains biologically demand a coherent, complete story, even when we are totally blind to the actual facts, just like a toddler sitting in a living room.
And we are left with the image of that alien auditor circling the Earth, looking down, utterly confident that he knows exactly what is happening based on the tangible things he can count, the factories, the cars, the computers. But he is completely hopelessly wrong because he cannot possibly know the invisible stories going on inside everyone else's heads. He is all of us trying to navigate an economy driven by fictions.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this right now? How do you actually apply this to your daily life?
The next time you feel absolute 100% certainty about an investment, a major career move, or where you think the economy is heading, I want you to pause. Ask yourself some hard questions. Am I actually looking at objective statistics, or have I just been seduced by an appealing fiction?
Am I filling in my blind spots with a story I simply want to be true, because the alternative is scary?
And most importantly, how wide is my margin of safety when I inevitably turn out to be wrong?
It requires a profound level of intellectual humility, and it leads to a final, lingering thought that expands just a bit beyond our main discussion today. But I think it's the ultimate takeaway. We spent this time looking at how stories are the ultimate economic force, capable of crashing markets when they turn negative. But consider the inverse of that.
The flip side.
If collective fictions are truly this powerful, it suggests that the most critical financial skill you can develop in your life isn't advanced mathematics, forensic accounting, or algorithmic trading.
It's not the spreadsheet.
No, it's literature, it's psychology, it's sociology and empathy. The person who can accurately read the emotional fictions of the masses, the person who understands what people desperately want to believe, holds the keys to understanding the economy. So as you go about your week, whether you are in a boardroom, a car dealership, or just at the dinner table, ask yourself, what story is the person sitting across from me telling themselves right now?
And how is that invisible narrative dictating their real-world actions? That is a brilliant place to leave it. The hardware is useless without understanding the software.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the tangible world is only half the picture. Stay curious, keep widening that margin of safety, and always, always keep questioning the narratives around you.